Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Kalayim, Pedekei, Halacha Vav, and Halacha Zayin. We're learning today Daf Nun Beis. We left off on Daf Nun Beis on top of the Amid Mamish, beginning with the Gemara Amid Rabbi Lazar. Let's quickly review what we just had on Daf Nun Aleph Amid Beis in Halacha Vav. First of all, there's a difference between whether one violates Kalayim by planting versus whether one is violating Kalayim when the vegetable sprouted on its own, so to say, and the person allowed it, maintained it, was mekayim it. And as we mentioned, by planting, the moment the person did the act of planting, not only did they violate a lav, but now by kerem, everything becomes asur b'hana'ah immediately. Versus if it sprouted on its own, and the violation is that the person did not uproot it. So we learned a couple of steps need to happen. First step is there has to be awareness. So if a vegetable on its own sprouted in a vineyard, even if it was there, even if it grew a lot, way beyond the share of 200s, way beyond that, there is no isur. Amazing things, the products could be consumed. Now, when the person becomes aware, even at that moment, it's not like aware, boom, isur hana. There has to be after the awareness, the wrong attitude. The attitude is, I'm happy that it's here. In other words, he has to neglect to fulfill his or her duty of uprooting it with the details we learned in the Mishnah. And even after there was this neglect, now you have to, from the awareness and neglect, till when the sprouted vegetable creates an isur hana, it has to grow a certain amount. We're linking it to the din that kilei hakenim is batel echad b'mosayim, which means that if it's only 199 of heter, correct, and one isur, if the isur is a 200th, it's not nullified. So when it reaches the point where it grew after the neglected 200ths, then it becomes asur, and we're going to go with Shita Sarambam, that once the vegetable grew to 200s and the vegetable became asur bahana, so then so does the vineyard. And how much of the vineyard? We just learned this a few mishnayos ago, the radius of 16, the circle of 16 ams. Now, the Mishnah expanded, how do you differentiate between planting and sprouting? I mean, the literal, the pshat, we know. But the Mishnah gave a gavaldik case. You have a person that's planting, because this person owns two fields, a grain field, stay Laban, and he owns right nearby with the right space, a kedem, a vineyard. He's planting grain in the grain field. Wind, unbeknownst to him, wind blew some of the grains that he was throwing in the ground and it threw it into the vineyard. So the Mishnah differentiated that if the wind blew the grain behind him, even though he was doing an act of planting, it's called sprouting because there was no awareness. If the wind blew, it's amazing. We're learning this. Tess, Tavis, Pei, when there's a lot of winds in Los Angeles and fires. But if the wind blew the grains in front of him, then it's considered planting. That is what we learned in the Mishnah. And the Gemara will explain with greater detail this difference that the Mishnah gave. And guys, don't forget that if it's still considered sprouting, so we know the din of sprouting. If it's considered planting, so then the Mishnah, Rabbi Kiva Oimer, the Mishnah gave a three-step detail, three pratim. But now, if it's planting, like we mentioned, you have to uproot it because the isur hana begins immediately. The Mishnah could have just said uproot it. Now, what do you do with it when it's uprooted? If it's asur right away, like we mentioned, because you planted it, then when you uproot it, you have to burn it. The Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah says that if grass was growing out, you have to overturn it. If there are stalks that have kernels in it, you have to scatter the kernels in the air. If it's already dug on, we already said yesterday, dug in is when it reached a third of its maximum growth. This grain already grew into a third or more of its maximum growth. That's called dagan. Now you have to burn it. So the next detail we'll have in today's daf will be what's this thing with the three stages? And actually, we're going to have a fascinating machlokes amoraim, and according as we'll see, perhaps the isur of hanaa midoiraisa is only by dagan, and if it's pre-dagan stage, then we'll see whether it's mutar completely, whether it's only asur midrabanan, or no, or since this will become a grain, the isur hanaa begins immediately, and then the Mishnah's three stages will have to be expounded, as the Gemara will explain. Okay, that is more or less going to be the Gemara's biur on halacha vav. Now, halacha zayin covers many different topics. It's mamash fascinating. The Mishnayos, just the information. First of all, in Parshas Kiseitze, so it has been a while since we quoted the pasuk. When the pasuk says, "Le'sizra karmacha koloim pentigdash hamleya hazera asher tizra." So hazera asher tizra, the seed that you sow. Learn Chazal, the whole Isur of Kalayim is when this is a seed that's normally planted. What are we excluding? I'll give you a mashal. Even people like us, something called weeds. We heard weeds. Weeds is, you don't want the weeds. It's something that generally takes up the nourishment. There's nothing good in the weeds. Fakir, people are busying themselves weeding out the weeds. So what happens if you have weeds in a kedem? As we will see, something that's usually not maintained does not create kalayim. Even if you became aware of it and you don't uproot it and it grew, doesn't matter, because it's not something that's usually sown. That's more or less a straightforward din. Another gavaldik layer of pratim that we never had until now. However, we had before in this Masechta a few times already the differentiation between plants that are usually planted for their seeds, l'mashal grains. Guys, I know that the seeds could be replanted, but if you eat wheat, what are you eating? You're eating the seed. You're not eating the seed, you're crushing it, you're grinding it, you're making it into flour. But there are certain plants whose main purpose is for its seed to be consumed. Then we have other plants whose seeds are not eaten. They are planted for their leaves to be eaten. And we learned a few times, this is the way we define yerek. The definition of a yerek, halachically, in the context of kalayim, are plants whose seeds are not eaten. The leaves are eaten. That we already had until now, with the nafkaminas. Guys, we're learning new words. They sound familiar, but we never learned these words. In the second category of plants that are planted for their leaves, you have one category that's called minei yerakis. Makes sense, because we're calling that a yerek. But in this category, there's something called minei zeroyim. Minei yerakis, according to most, and that's the way we will learn, are these plants who are planted primarily for their leaves. They are planted in small patches. By the way, that's the way vegetables are normally planted. Small patches, a vegetable patch. That's called minei yerakis. Minei zeroyim are same, but they are usually planted in very large areas, similar to the way grain is planted. It's planted the way a grain field is. That's called minei zeroyim. And we'll see the nafkamina and halacha. And a final detail, we'll learn a lot more when we learn it inside, but a general detail is that only plants, we're going back mamish to daf aleph, only plants that are made for consumption are subject to kalayim. If you have a plant who's primarily, by the way, consumption doesn't have to mean only human consumption, right? What was the first, what was that called? The jujubes. I remember in the beginning, daf aleph, we had all of these new items. By the way, jujubes are very healthy. Since then, I already ate jujubes. I made a shechiyanu, and it was mamish gavaldik. It tastes like a muffin. It tastes like a cinnamon muffin from the Oibishter directly off the nature, like Mashiach's times, off the trees. We had zunim. That was what it was. And when we learned about zunim, zunim was a product that's eaten by doves, remember? So even if it's made for animal consumption, it's also included in the dinim of kalayim. But if something is primarily planted not for consumption at all, there are certain plants that are primarily planted for their fibers to make garments. And don't let, now, you can't mix linen with wool. There are certain plants that were planted to be mixed with wool. That's 100% mutter. It's not linen. Those plants don't create kalayim. Because if you plant them in a vineyard, you're doing nothing wrong. Okay, and we're going to learn more pratim as we unpack the topic. And the end of today's daf, the beginning of tomorrow's daf, we'll already be speaking about specific plants. And the Kevin will have a field day finding them if Google is right and putting pictures. Okay, daf lam nun beis, all the way on the top. So again, the Mishnah differentiates. You are planting, but you're planting a grain field. The wind blew the seeds into a kedem. So the Mishnah says it depends. That's what we had on halacha vav. If if the wind blew the seeds behind you, that's called sprouting mutter. Now again, mutter doesn't mean mutter. Mutter means that if you become aware of it and you neglect it, then you begin a problem. We know that. But it's not called planting. There's no isur right away. But if I'm just reading the end of the Mishnah halacha. But if the wind blew it in front of you, that's called planting. And again, the details, Rabbi Akiva Omer, we're going to read the details in a moment. But just in this difference, let me say by heart what the Gemara is struggling with. Where was this person planting the grain? There are two ways. It could be that he's planting the grain in the grain field. Understand that the wind blowing the seeds behind him is the least problematic there. He was doing mamish nothing wrong. He's standing in the grain field. Or maybe the Mishnah is even speaking about a case where he's standing in the vineyard. So what is he doing planting grain? Because he's standing at the end of his vineyard. He's lazy. He's already there. And he has in his pocket grain. And what he does is he throws the grain into the grain field. Maybe even there, if the wind blew some of it back or prevented the grains of going all the way to the vineyard, behind him, it's still considered only sprouting. But he's a little bit more guilty here because what are you doing throwing grain when you're standing in the kedem? So let's find out exactly what is the case of the Mishnah. So Amar Rabbi Lazar, that our Mishnah Masnisa is ba'oimed b'tztei lavan. He is standing in the grain field, like we mentioned. And then if it goes behind him, then it's called sprouting. It's not called planting, even though he was doing an act of planting. Doesn't matter. He was planting grain in a green field. Now, that is what Rabbi Lazar says. It's still not clear. It's not clear what Rabbi Lazar is trying to say. And don't forget, guys, the Mishnah gave two cases. It gave the lenient case if the wind blew behind him, and it gave the strict case if the wind blew it in front of him. So we have to know on which part was he speaking that he's standing in the grain field, or let me word it exactly the way the Gemara words it by heart. It's Gavaldik. Did Rabbi Lazar mean to say that even if he's standing in the grain field, or only if he's standing in the grain field? And you'll see the big nafkamina between one or the other connected to, is he speaking about the lenient case? Is Rabbi Lazar limiting the leniency? Or is he not limiting the leniency? And as we'll see it inside. So Rabbi Zajac, he wanted to understand, Zajac Rabbi Lazar, Mai is amart. What are you saying? Did he mean only that the Mishnah is only when you're ba'omed? Somehow implying that if you're standing in the vineyard, that's going to be worse. As taka, it's going to limit. That would mean the Gemara is going to speak it out. I'll just say it by heart because it took me a while to chop it yesterday. That when you're standing in the vineyard, even if the wind blew the seeds behind you, and some of the seeds ended up falling in the vineyard, that's not called sprouting. That's called planting. Who asked you to do anything with grain when you're standing in the vineyard? It limits the leniency. Or no, afilu oimed. Afilu oimed would mean that Rabbi Lazar is focusing on the chamur dika side, that if the wind blew it in front of you, then you're guilty of planting. So for that, Rabbi Lazar says, don't think that if the wind blew it in front of you, it's considered planting if you were standing in the vineyard. That for sure. Even if you're standing, even if you were standing in the stay lavan, and there's nothing wrong with you planting grain in your grain field. But if the wind blew it in front of you, you saw the seeds flying, you can't call it sprouting because you were doing an act of planting. So your act of planting with the awareness leaves it in the category of planting, and right away you got to uproot it. You have no time for anything. I feel it. And the Gemara speaks on both sides. This is just what I said by heart is inside. In Tamar ba'omed b'lavan, if Rabbi Lazar's statement ba'omed means dafka ba'omed, then he must have been referring to the leniency. That means that he's limiting the kula. He's saying, not. What not? Can be what l'chumra b'stei kerem is the worst. It means that even though the Mishnah allows for you to say that if the wind blew it behind you, you're good to go, doesn't matter, it's called sprouting. So he says, no. That's only if you were planting it where normally people plant it. You are planting grain in a grain field. If you're standing in the kerem, even though your intention was to throw the seeds into your own neighboring grain field, but you shouldn't have been doing it from the kerem. And therefore, even if the wind blew it behind you, you're guilty. It's a climb right away. So either Rabbi Elazar meant to limit the leniency, or the other side, no, he meant to say even Oymed. Even Oymed can only work even if he's focusing on the stringent part of the Mishnah, that if the wind blew it in front of you, that's called planting. Front of you, it's called planting. Now, then we say, he hada. Zicher, for sure, if you're standing in the vineyard and you threw the grain and the wind blew it in front of you, that's for sure called planting. So for that, Rabbi Elazar says that even if you were standing in the grain field and you're planting grain in the grain field, if the wind blew it in front of you, it's also considered planting. And what do we accomplish if we say that Rabbi Elazar's words is on the stringent part? Because then it's going to chap that Rabbi Elazar was not limiting the leniency. Then it's going to chap that if a guy is standing in a vineyard and he's throwing seeds to his neighboring grain field, and the wind blew some of the seeds behind him, it's still not considered planting. If we don't teach that Rabbi Elazar is limiting the leniency, then we extend the leniency. So this is a real inquiry to understand, like Rabbi Elazar came to clarify, but we don't understand what he meant.
All right, whether it goes in front of him or behind him, he's not going to be able to find the seeds.
So you're asking a great point, and that's exactly Kevan, why the Mishnah said, and we said at the Kitzur when we learned the Mishnah yesterday, that in such an action, we do not demand of you to go searching for seeds, which will be mission impossible.
You have to let it grow.
What we do say is, and I'm going to repeat those words just quickly right now, is that those seeds will begin to sprout. And there are three stages. There's the grass stage, the stalk stage, the grain stage, and the Mishnah says what you need to do at every stage.
Got it.
You're right, Kevin. Very good. So first, let's clarify what the din is. So the Gemara says, listen, from the words of Rabbi Elazar, but we found the Baraisa. And where the presumption will be that Rabbi Elazar also knew the Baraisa, he must have aligned himself with the Baraisa. Nashmi'ina min Ada. It says in the Baraisa, Rav Shimon ben Yehuda Oymen, in the name of Rav Shimon, right? That's the Rashbi. Hazoreya v'siyaratu yiruach la'achoyrov. Right? If it's blowing behind you, muter, so far as the same. But here the Baraisa adds a reason. The Mishnah didn't give a reason. And the words are muter mepnei shehu oynes. Mamash and oynes. Now we get what he's saying. Guys, you can't say that when a person is standing in a kerem and he's throwing grain to his neighboring field, if some of those seeds fall where he's standing, you can't call that an oynes. People don't do it that way. Don't stand here and throw your seeds over there. That's the Gavalda. No, the Baraisa limits the leniency. Minan kaiminon. What are we talking about? When could you say that even though the wind blew it behind you, you're an oynes? Why? If you're standing in your own vineyard, then the Gemara says these words, guys, oiver avedo. It's already considered you're misbehaving. You're playing with the boundaries. Why are you throwing grain to the grain when you're standing on your vineyard? Why would you do that? Va'at omrat mutar can be. Oynes is taka when you were standing in your grain field. You're planting grain in your grain field. Wind blew it into your kerem. That's called an oynes. Ella kinan kaiminan. They love it. Beautiful. So since we see from the Baraisa that the chumrah for sure, if it goes in front of you, will always mach. The leniency that the wind blew it behind you, therefore it's not called planting, is only when you were doing nothing wrong. Nothing wrong means you're standing in your grain field. And since this is what the Baraisa is saying, so therefore that is it has to be that exactly that is what Rabbi Elazar is trying to say. Okay, Adka. Now, very good. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva with the hay over here, Im asavim yupach, im aviv yenapetz, im hevia dogin yedolik. Why did he separate it into three? And we're going to have a big machlokes. We can even say Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, even though there are other Amoraim involved, but it's a big machlokes. So Imasavim Yupach says the Holy Gemara Rab Ze'eda, in the name of Rab Shimon ben Lakish, taken that is, in the name of Rab Hoshaya, but Reish Lakish is involved. Imasavim Yupach, you know why Imasavim Yupach? He holds, Chevra, that Kilei HaKerem is only on Dagon. So when you plant a grain, and it only grew in its initial phase, which is basically a grass, a green grass coming out of the ground, that grass is not the Kilei HaKerem. So even though you planted it, what are we saying by planting? When you plant something, it's Asur B'Hana right away, not the grass. The grass could be used. You're obligated to take the grass out of the ground, but the grass can be consumed. So that's why the Mishnah doesn't say burn the grass. Burn this. No, why would you have to burn it? Use it. Just uproot it. Furthermore, Im Aviv means that it already developed so much that kernels began. Aviv is like spring, the beginning. It began to ripen. Didn't reach a third. That is Asur Midrabanan. And therefore, the shaft remains mutter. And even the kernel, since it's Asur B'Hana only Midrabanan, you don't have to burn it. It's enough for you to have it scattered in the wind. Beautiful. And the dagan is Asur. Only if that which is halachically called planted, Kevin, right? It flew in front of you. You don't know where it fell. Nothing you can do. If by the time you got to it, it already grew a third, so now it's called dagan. Now you got to uproot it and you got to burn it. The Torah says that it's Asur B'Hana. Things that are Asur B'Hana, let's go to Chametz and Pesach, you burn. It's amazing. There you also have a machlokes Tanoim, whether it's good enough to scatter the Chametz in the wind. It's interesting. Here we're saying that that's good enough only when it's Asur Midrabanan. So that's the lenient opinion of Reish Lakish. However, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan says, Hakoil Asur. Rabbi Yochanan holds that when you have a seed of grain that halachically was planted in a vineyard, the Isur Hana starts immediately. And no, Kavan, you don't have to go searching for the seeds. You don't have to do that. But whatever comes out, you gotta get rid of. And now the kasha is, so why didn't the Mishnah just say whatever comes out of the ground burn? So so why did our Mishnah give these three stages that Imasavim Yupach, Imaviv Yenapetz, and Mevia Dogan Tidalek, just write Tidalek, right? Burn it. Because there was fires. All of these fires, someone is starting them. Starting a fire is not so simple. So here, the Gemara, I'm just kidding. So the Gemara answers, no, I'll tell you why. Because this is Gavaldik. And we're quoting a Mishnah and Tamura. Guys, we learned this together. In the Bible, it's Tamura Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis. Ha'orla v'kilei akerem, which we know are Asur B'Hana. So a simple Mishnah. What do you do with it? Guys, what do you do with something that you cannot even have benefit? So I would say like this, by Avodah Zarah is the worst. By Avodah Zarah, you get rid of it. What about this and that? What about others? So the Mishnah says, it depends. It depends. Foods that normally are to be burnt when you want to get rid of them. What type of foods do you burn? Foods that are dry. Dry is burnable. That's why things are burning here. Then, yeah, you get rid of it by burning it. But the Mishnah says, the types of foods that are not burnt. You know what foods are not burnt? Liquids. Or foods that are very moist. You don't burn. You don't do that. So how do you get rid of it? You cover, bury. Yakir, where else did we have we had a whole siyam mesechta of the difference between burning and burying? Maybe it was Tamura. Remember a whole daf, a whole siyam of a mesechta was gavaldik, burning and burying. Yesh bazeh ma she'ein bazeh. I think maybe it wasn't Kach, maybe it wasn't Tamura. But bottom line is, that's exactly what he's saying. What he's saying is that you get rid of it. You get rid of it the way it's the most effective. Or you get rid of something the way people commonly would get rid of it. Grass, people get rid of grass by uprooting it. It's very nothing. It's unsubstantial. That's it. When a shaft, when you have already the kernels, you blow them in the air. That's the way, in other words, you are allowed to get rid of it the way people normally get rid of it. That's why the Mishnah differentiated, but we end up here with a huge machlokes again, whether the Isur of Kalayim is only on Dagan, And prior to that phase, says Reish Lakish, there's no Isur Doiraisa. At some point, real early on, not even Midrabana, and Rabbi Yechanan says that's not the case. Now let's go back. The Gemara is going to be focusing on Shitas Reish Lakish. It says the Gemara, Rabbi Yaakov Baridi, B'Shem Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Based on this Shita, it's going to come out something very interesting. That Pa'amim, there'll be times that you'll have a stalk of grain, and the entire kash, the straw, will be permitted, and the dagan will be asin. Not asin midrabanan, asin midorais. You can have a stalk which will be able to be machalek minakotze elakotze between the staff, between the straw, and the kernel. And the same thing in the other direction. Pa'amim, that you'll have the kashin will be asurim, and the dagan will be mutar legamre. According to Rabbi Yechanan, it's not shayek, because it's something that will become grain. If it was planted in a vineyard, it's all asur b'hana. But according to Reish Lakish, not only do we delay the isur until it becomes grain, but because of that, there will be times that we'll be able to have an item and say part of it is mutar, even midrabanan, part of it is asur midoraisa b'hana. Now, when is one? So he says like Sora beheter. Sora beheter would mean you planted the grain with the right distance from the kerem. You planted it beheter. And what happened was, v'sichei chal gabov. Later, someone came, you came, according to Reb Shimon, the owner, according to others, anyone, and they took a vine that was planted 4 amos or 5 amos away, but they extended the vine, and the vine now on the trellis is hanging over the grain, and as we've never learned it yet inside, but the halacha is that any vine, a branch, that's trained over grain, even if the root, even if the trunk is a mile away, doesn't matter, that grain becomes awesome. Both become awesome. So here, what happened is that, guys, we're turning to that Anun Beis Amud Beis. You planted it beheter. At a point later on, you added the problem. So what do we say? We don't say since now you planted it became awesome. The kernels that grow are awesome. But what we don't say is that if the kernels are usher, so then the straw is usher also. We don't say that. What we do say is hakashin remain mutter because they developed in a permitted state. Only the dagan is usher. Let me give you another example in the opposite direction. Zara be'isr. Zara be'isr there was a vineyard. You planted grain under the vine. You planted it be'isr. And then at some point you says, "Oh, Gavaldik, what am I doing?" It collided. So you took you planted it under a trellis where again the trunk is 5 amos away, but the vine is over there. And at some point the person says, "Oh, well, God forbid, what am I doing?" He took the vine and he put it in a different direction. So when the beginning was growing, it was a problem. Later he took away the problem. Now, when we say the beginning, it doesn't mean the grass part. The grass part we just learned is b'chlal not a problem. You can have enough. We're speaking about it already developed enough where there's a problem. The hevet is aschach. So here we say the kashim are asurim, but the dagan is muter, which is quite amazing. Now we know from other klalei halacha, we don't always say that, right? When it comes to milk from a kosher animal is kosher. Milk from a non-kosher animal is, remember that? We learned the Mishnah. I think that's what the words. So here we're saying that you can have kashim. The kashim are asurim, and the grain, according to Reish Lakish, since the grain grew in a state of heted, so the Gemara abzeira boy. To go in a chomer dikasai, I can tolerate that. In other words, you only move the trellis after the stalks were fully developed. So so the stalks remain mutter. But now that the kernels are developing, and now the kernels are developing when it's under a vine, it becomes us. I can tolerate that. But how can I say in the latter case where you planted it be'isur, the kashim are asurim? Why would the dagan be mutter? Gadal mitoich isur, something that's growing from what? Now, where is it getting nourishment from? That's the question. I gave my example of milk. Where does the milk come from? It comes from the mother. Coming from her blood became milk. When you have a kash, You have straw, you have the stalk. And in it, the kernel is growing. Where is it getting nourishment from? I think that's the Gemara's emphasis. If it's getting nourishment from the stalk, if the stalk is asur, then the kernel has to be asur. That's a Gemara's kasha. Gadol mitoy chiser va'at omar mutar hayotzim in atome tome. So the Gemara says no. Rab Zeira kedate. Amar Rab Zeira b'shem Rabbi Yonason. Me'ingen, one chiddush over the other. So first of all, I want to say the following, that the nourishment of the kernel is coming from the ground. It's important. Coming from the ground. But that's not enough to give the answer. This is fascinating, huh? Now we're going to go into this case, guys, a new case. The case is the case of Rabbi Yonason. You have his example. You have an onion. The onion was initially planted and it grew in a vineyard. This onion is asur b'hana'ah. What really should happen is uproot it and burn it. That's not what this guy did. He uprooted it and he planted it in a permissible place. He planted it out there where there's no problem planting. Now, another thing, we already learned this in other areas. Certain seeds, when you put it in the ground, most of the seeds, they disintegrate. Zaroi kala, but not the onion. The onion doesn't disintegrate, which makes it worse because the isur is be'en. What happens is if you uproot an onion from here and you put it there, if you know what you're doing, it continues to grow, which is exactly what happened. So now the onion continued to grow in a place where there's no isur. Now let me ask you a question. Based on what we learned yesterday, we spoke about bittul. What were to happen if the onion added an additional 200 parts to the original isur dika part? So if you apply the din of bittul, if you were to apply it, so then you can eat the whole onion. So let's see. So Rabbi Yonason says, b'shem Rabbi Yonason, we say, batel shel kilei kerem sha'akara, you uprooted it, ushis solo, you replanted it in a permissible place. He holds, afilu moisav kama isur, kama asur, even kama asur means it grew many times more than the isur. What's many times? The bittul, 200 times more than the original onion that you planted in the ground. He holds, it remains asur. Not only the original part, everything remains asur. Why? Because she'ein gidulei isur mailen esur isur. Something that's growing from that which is asur can never be mutter enough to nullify it. How great is that? In other words, we learned this concept, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, in the opposite direction. Let me say these words, reported the Tosfos. So it was 2 days ago. That nullification cannot take place when what you are using for the nullification is growing from something that's asur. It's like you're saying, the root is rotten. What do you expect? The whole thing was rotten. What you want to say, that which was added from a davar asur should be mevatel. The is doesn't work that way. That shitas Rabbi Yonason. Okay. However, one second, let me finish out. But the Gemara is very mekatzed in the Yerushalmi. Reish Lakish disagrees with Rab Zeira. Let me just say, Reish Lakish holds that if the onion added 200 parts more than the original replanted onion, the whole thing is mutter. Why? Because the new growth is not coming from the onion. The new growth is coming from the ground. Coming from the ground. So just like he holds that the additional growth of the onion is coming from the ground is mutter. Same thing here. When you have a staff, the staff is asur, the shaft, the kashin. The kernel is not coming from the kash. The kernel is coming from the ground. So therefore, here there's no bittul. They're separated items, but the kernel itself is mutter. And this is so deep. Let's speak about again that we always link Reish Lakish to a Baal Tshuva. So a person, God forbid, right? A person is a bandit. A person is steeped into misbehavior, horrible choices. And then they go ahead and they do a mitzvah. So one attitude will be, who did the mitzvah? A rotten person. What good is it? It's like a mitzvah haba ba'aveda. In other words, if the person is a shtik aveda, the shlukish does not subscribe to that. No, the aveda is an aveda. The aveda has to be dealt with. But the good that you're adding is not coming from your sin. It's coming from your godliness. It's coming from your connection to Mother Earth. In other words, to the Eibishter. That's good. That gives people hope. That motivates a person to do good. Instead of telling a person that since your roots are rotten, so everything you do is rotten. Tshuva is predicated on the sheet of Reish Lakish, on this attitude. Yes, Kevin.
All right, the distance of the onion from the tree, from the vine, does that matter?
Sure. In other words, it began, Kevin, I planted an onion in my vineyard. It was within Daladamas. I'll go more than that. It was within 6 tvachim. I want to say a case where and I uprooted the onion, and wrongfully I replanted it. Reish Lakish holds you shouldn't have done that. But now that it grew, if it grew 200 more, now you can do bittul. Okay, weiter. Now again, the 7th Mishnah is filled. It's filled, packed. Let's see how far we can get. So the first din of the Mishnah we spoke in the introduction, that from the words in the pasuk, Hazera Asher Tizra, we learn that the whole Isser of Kalayim is only regarding foreign seed that's normally planted. If it's not normally planted and you didn't plant it, the problem is that you are being Mekayim it. If people normally are Mekayim it, then you got yourself a problem. If people normally are not Mekayim it, why do you don't have a problem? And the example the Mishnah gives is Hamakayim Koitzim Bakedem. You have thorns. No one is Mekayim thorns. So it damages. Rabbi Eliezer Oimer, nevertheless, Kidesh. The question will be why. Guys, we quoted Rabbi Eliezer about I'll spill the beans. Because in a certain city in Arabia, they would feed their camels these koitzim. And even though you're living in a place where here no one feeds their camels koitzim, either because they don't have camels, or because here in America you give your camels steaks, whatever the minig is. So nevertheless, that's the word of Rabbi Eliezer. Since in one place, all places. And the Chachamim say, and if you are living in a place where you don't, even when you have camels, if you don't feed these thorns to your camels, so it's not something that people are mekayim. So it's not included in the whole problem. There's no problem. We're going to come back to that in the Gemara. Next din in the Mishnah. Now again, I want to chazer. We already learned the difference. Something that's planted for its seed to be eaten is not called yerek. The definition of it's either grains or legumes. The way we halachically are defining vegetables primarily is when you plant something, primarily to eat its leaves and not to eat its seed. Okay. Now, having said that, we are now being machalik in this plant that you plant to eat the leaves into one category that's called minei yerakos. Minei yerakos is the class of vegetables that are normally planted in small patches versus minei zeroyim. These were the words we learned in the Rambam, guys, in the beginning. Minei zeroyim, that they are normally planted in large fields. Says the Mishnah, we want to know what is the status of minei zeroyim vis-a-vis kilei akerem. Ha'iros, iris. You'll have a lot of time later at the end if we'll get there, Kevin and Tamar, to find pictures. But knock yourself out if you want to. Vakisois, ivy. No idea what this is. Shoshanas hamelech. Shoshanas hamelech. Shoshanas hamelech. He touches a white lily. I would say a white rose. Anyway, Shoshanas hamelech. And chol min zeroyim. Min zeroyim, guys, not zeroyim. Zeroyim is the chilei akerem. Says the Mishnah, einom kilayim bekerem. Wow, I want to make one thing clear. When our Mishnah says einom kilayim bekerem, it means that it's only asr midrabanan, and therefore it's not asr bahana. But don't think you can plant them lechatchila. Just to make that clear, you're violating a rabbinic. No, it's the Mishnah is telling you that only plants that are in the category of minei yerakos are included in the isur of kilei hakedem, aside of grains. You got it. Okay. Now, we'll get back to that. Everything will be unpackaged in the Gemara. Canvas, hemp, cannabis, Here in LA, cannabis is grown for people to get drugged up on. Very good. And cannabis in the times of Chazal, so many people used it fibers. I want you to know that cannabis is lechatchila allowed to be mixed with wool. Linen and wool is awesome. It's amazing. People say, because wool is from the animal kingdom and linen is from the plant kingdom. It's not enough. Other plant items on all levels could be mixed with wool. That's what people grew it for. So therefore, the Tarfon says, so here you go. That is confirming that the Torah is saying good. He knows. He has. If you have cannabis clothes, in the case of emergency, you can smoke your clothes. That's the mile of having it. If it works, Einam Kalayim, because he holds that it's not cultivated for its food, it's primarily cultivated for its fiber to make clothing, to mix it with wool. However, the Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim hold that some people eat it. Now, I don't know what the din of smoking is.
The seeds are very healthy.
Seeds are very healthy, healthy to eat. I'm just asked if something is planted to be smoked as drugs, is it called food?
No, it's a different species of hemp that you get.
Guys, we're here in LA. Here we're in LA. There's a lot of, we should write a whole mafaidish and all the different types of cannabis, and we're going to make soon that there's not even machlekes, Rabbi Kiva, and Chachamim and Tarfon. Okay, now, final din in the Mishnah is haki noros. Now, again, Kevin will enjoy this. Let's go that kinoros is artichoke. Artichoke is a minyarik. Okay? A minyarik, we said, not minizanoim, a minyarik. Oh, I like the picture. Should have a din of a kilei akademi doiraisa. Guys, trees are not included in the isur of kilei akadem. You can plant trees together with vines. So the Mishnah is saying that artichoke, a chiddush, is kalayim bekadem, because you might have thought that it has a din of a tree. Why would you think it's a tree? Now that I saw Kevin's picture, it looks like a tree.
The artichoke tree?
What's
a bush, kind of?
It's a kind of bush. Can you put it back up, Kevin? Because Brian wants to see your tree over here. Here we go.
You can smoke it.
No, you can't smoke it. Okay, weiter. Now, in the picture that you put up, now that's chap. I know it's late. I got a minute. We've already said it by heart. We had it before. So the first case in the Mishnah was, right, Hamakayim kutzim bekerem. Kutzim are thorns. It's not food. Why would Rabbi Eliezer say it's kiddush? So the Gemara explains. Amar Rabbo, Talmud Rabbi Kiva. She came a kaim and oisom legmal about Rabbi and Arabi over there. The Arabs, they feed their camels these types of thorns. Now the kiddush is, again, guys, there's no doubt. If you're living in a place where it's used to feed your animals, your camels, everyone will hold that it's kilei akedem. The chiddush of our sugya is that you're living in a place where not Barabi. We're living in Eretz Yisrael. Machdo Eretz Yisrael. And over here, no one feeds koitzim to camels. If you have a camel, you feed it the food that people buy for the dogs here costs more than your lunch. You feed it food. Right. So that's that Rabbi Eliezer is mechadish, that since in one place in the world they feed it to camels, everywhere it's classified as food. I know we have a lot to go. Okay, we'll stop over here. We'll stop over here because it's late to be continued.